Hey everybody, Dan here. First things first, big thank yous have to go out to Ryan, Justin, Paul, all the staff and volunteers at TooManyGames 2016 who make that event happen. It was a terrific 3 days. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak and to be a part of the event. It was a terrific time, and we certainly hope to be back next year. That said, the following video is a abridged version of the panel lecture that was given on Friday night entitled Transmediation of Games and Opera. It's based on some of my research at George Mason University, and I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching. First things first, thank you all for coming out. My name is Daniel Greenberg. My presentation today is it's a graduate paper I've been working on for a while. It's called Touchscreen to Me Now. Specifically refers to Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, or the Magic Flute, which was done in 2013 at the Salzburg Festival in Austria, and then converted over to a mobile game. Just to cover the term real quick, when I say transmediation, what I mean is taking something from one medium and migrating it to another medium. So largely today's discussion is going to be about that process, about going from the world of opera to video games and back again, and what it means for the form and its methods of communication going one way and then back the other. I'm going to be doing this the whole time, and I sincerely apologize. So opera. Who here has actually gone and seen an opera live? Half you? Opera.
20 minutes count?
20
minutes, that count?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. When I say opera, what I'm really referring to is the form, and it's understood to be constituent of a couple elements. There's the libretto, which is essentially your storyline, your plot. It's the things that are happening in the opera. There's the score, which is your musical accompaniment. And of course you have the stage direction and other ancillary elements that make up the performance. I bring this up because for transmediative purposes, these are not entirely abnormal concepts. When we think of video games, we think of similar ideas, right? Plot, characters, stage and level design, music. And a lot of what I do and a lot of what I study is where these worlds intersect. It can be something as simple as leitmotif, Wagner's famous methodology of using musical cues to either signal certain things happening in the period of the story or to indicate a certain character is going to arrive. This is something video games have taken to heart tenfold with character-based themes and melodies that repeat throughout the game, as well as audio cues for certain instances and for certain events. So leitmotif is just one of numerous examples. But for today's purposes, we're not so much talking about the specific tools that games and opera share, but rather what happens to the narrative when transferring from one to the other and back again. In 2013, there was a big push to try to get more young people into opera. I can attest this is a problem. I went to go see La Boheme at the Kennedy Center in late 2014, and I was probably the only person under the age of 80. It is a beautiful performance. The stage design was amazing, and all I could think the whole time I was there is it would be really wonderful if somebody young enough to tell this to people in the future was seeing it now. And the people who run the Salzburg Festival recognize this. They see that this is a problem and that opera is an art form that isn't exactly communicated to the next generation terribly well beyond, say, Merry Melodies and Bugs Bunny. Now, to do this, they have to take a certain amount of care because the Salzburg Festival considers itself very high art. So they don't want to lower their standards too much in such a way that it no longer is a performance behooving their high station. But at the same time, they really want to appeal to the next generation. So they reach out, and it turns out this Japanese director, Eamon Miyamoto, no relation, has an idea to recreate Mozart's The Magic Flute, Die Zauberflöte. Now he's done a number of Mozart performances in Japan in the past. This is his bailiwick. He loves doing Mozart-based operas. And so he decides he's going to make a video game themed version of the Magic Flute. And Yes I Do comes in to do the set design, the costuming, and some of the more interesting projection. On the left here, you can see this large snake is projected on that isometrically positioned background. The stage was carefully designed here, you can see, to intentionally give that axiomatic projection so that when the characters were on stage, they had the positioning and appearance of being characters in, think, a early era PS1 RPG. The same thing can be said for the character designs over on the right, although it's a little hard to see. I've got video of it that's a little clearer. The costume direction was intentionally done to give the characters large facets in bold, solid colors. The hairstyle is almost cubic in nature, intentionally designed to look as if these were characters in a video game. There was also a change to the libretto. In the Magic Flute, typically it starts in media res. The protagonist, Tamino, this poor fellow here, is running away from a giant snake, and that's how it starts. Miyamoto was deciding on how to bring the video game theme in, and apparently being a fan of Tron, and I won't spoil it, although I probably already have.
Leben 2.0. Der Großvater bringt für seinen Enkel ein Computerspiel nach Hause.
The grandfather has purchased a video game system for the grandchildren who are excited to play it.
Getrübt wird der Spaß des heimkehrenden Vaters, der seinen Job verliert. Irrtümlich wird die Taste des Computerspiels gedrückt. Der Vater
In as campy a manner as possible, the father falls into the television
so beginnt
and is transported to the world of the Magic Flute. From this point, the standard libretto kicks in. Now, this is all well and good, but it's important to make a little caveat here. Most reviews of opera, about 80% of your review or more, is going to be on the quality of the singers. How good were the vocalists? Did they hit their ranges? Do they have command of the room? While that's critically important for opera, for purposes of my research and for purposes of what we're doing, it's not really as important, because for transmediative purposes, when going from opera to video games, the singing level is less important than the other elements. In this case, what we're really wondering is how well did the video game elements migrate into the opera production? And in this sense, it was pretty decisively considered to be effective. The rather severe, or at least I'd say critical minds in Austria that review the Salzburg Festival, I remind you this is considered a very high-level festival, had very, very nice things to say about the inclusion of these game elements in the opera. They mentioned the costumes were a delight, that Miyamoto and the team used technology so stunned stage elements and three-dimensional video images seemed to blur into one another. I think the most telling statement that was made was one of the reviewers said he showed a lot of respect for Mozart. It's not an easy task to stage Mozart's home, basically to put on a video game themed version of a treasured Mozart opera in Salzburg, Austria. Takes some gumption, and he was considered to have pulled this off, for the most part, with flying colors. Which is good, but it's only half of our story. So, again, when I mentioned transmediation, I need to say that we go both directions with this production. We went from screen to stage. We took these video game elements and we migrated them into the Magic Flute, the stage production. But after that, 2 years later, we did the exact opposite. The Polish people that I mentioned, Yes I Do, decided to take the performance of the Magic Flute as imagined by Eamon Miyamoto, that specific performance, and reimagine it back again as a mobile puzzle game.
Run, Tamino. Find safety or die.
Now these aren't lines from the opera provided in subtitles, as opposed to surtitles. But otherwise what you're looking at is a pretty rudimentary
That was close.
puzzle platformer. To give you a contextual idea, you'd be swiping on any individual tile to move it to where you wanted it to go. And then obviously different tiles have different rules. Now, in some ways, this was very faithful. If you watch the performance of the Magic Flute, these are the same backdrops that were projected onto that isometric screen during the stage performance. The sprites for the characters were designed exactly as the costumes were designed for the characters in that opera performance. Something I want to point out, because where the mobile version struggles a little bit is effectively communicating the libretto with the Magic Flute.
Be sharp, be swift, be victorious.
That repeats. Which is nice, I guess you learn the lines, but if an opera is largely communicated through singing, what's migrated back is an incomplete version. And this is kind of one of my transmedial points, is when you take the video game elements and bring them into the opera, they are ancillary. So you are taking what is the primary thing from a video game, is the stylization of the characters, the levels, etc. These design concepts, and bring them into the opera. The opera still has its core element. It still has the performances, the arias. Whereas this migration coming backwards.
Enter the dark and awesome threesome. Die, monster, through our power, triumph. As the witches rush off to announce the arrival of the still unconscious but still very charming prince to their mistress, the Queen of the Night, we return in time a little.
So it's nice, you get a brief idea of what would be happening at this point in the opera, but that's the extent of the storytelling, unfortunately. So where the stage production had a fairly effective method of taking these video game elements to appeal, the puzzle platforming game, I think, failed in a way to take the operatic elements, you know, kind of the sweeping vocalizations and kind of the power of that method of storytelling and bringing that into the game. And that's trickier, and understandably so, for storytelling. What is something video games do that opera doesn't, generally speaking?
Interactivity.
Exact word I was looking for. It's the interactivity. So in a video game, you are expected to, maybe with the exception of Metal Gear Solid 2, participate in some way, shape, or form. And while you do that here, because you don't do that in the opera, you are migrating a different set over. And it's important to know what you're carrying over and what you're using it for. Whereas the video game elements of the 2013 performance were largely used to captivate a new audience and reimagine the world, realistically speaking, all the world of the Magic Flute the opera was used for here was to provide a skin for a fairly rudimentary puzzle game. Again, notice the angle you're looking at this at is an intentionally projected isometric angle. The backgrounds are projected on. The characters are set in uniform silhouette. She's got a very cubic appearance. These were all intentional decisions to try to make the performance seem more video game-like. Can be made low. You can read War and Peace, you can read a dime store novel. You can go watch a film that was nominated at Cannes, you can go watch a summer blockbuster with plenty of explosions. You can play a game, even these walking simulators that get kind of ripped of late. You can play games that have very blatant and high-level artistic intent. You can play games that were clearly meant to pass time. I don't think it's right to assume any one medium for any reason is inherently inefficient or unable to convey art at a certain point. It's just a matter of understanding the mechanisms it has to work with and using them to the best of your ability. In the case of transmediation, it's understanding what about the other form is worth bringing over. What from that can we use when we transfer the story from Form A to Form B? Transferring the video game mechanisms, the kind of the aesthetic mechanisms, into the storytelling of the opera proved more effective than taking the aesthetics of the opera and attempting to paint them over the mechanics of the puzzle game. Because the puzzle game inherently did not have the same methods of narrative conveyance that the opera had in actually explaining and kind of creating a cohesive magic flute. As you can see, they elevated the stage and extended it to give it the correct perspective relative to the audience. So that when you were sitting in the mezzanine, you actually saw it as if it was a true, think Hubert, that perfect isometric perspective. Transmediation is the migration of something from one form of art to another form of art. It could be book to movie, movie to game, game to opera in this case, and then opera back to game. It is my opinion that this can be done well and this can be done poorly. It was just neat for me to find both cases in a single location. In this case, an opera production that was given video game elements and then converted back into a video game. It's kind of a rare bird, and I enjoyed getting the opportunity to study it. There are plenty of other examples. I had considered bringing my Vravacelis discussion with me to TooManyGames, but I don't have 3 hours for my panel, so I can't get into all the nuances and details of what was done with that specific opera scene, and therefore this, little bite-sized mobile game made a perfect little 1-hour discussion, essentially.
But there could have been ways that they could have made some
Sure.
sort of interaction within the theater.
And I considered that at first, but what gave me pause was this. There was no specific game that was drawn from to gamify the magic flute, right? In the case of the return trip, when they took the opera in a single instance of that opera and made a game out of it, that was a clear demonstration of transmediation. The first case, you're right, is a little hazy. They essentially take the concepts or vision of what Miyamoto and Lavalike thought a video game was and integrate that into the opera. So it isn't a true transmediation, that's a good point. But what it did do was attempt to communicate in the form of opera a theoretical video game of the magic flute. They didn't have a video game, the magic flute, at the time to work with, so their next best option was to essentially modify the libretto by having the prelude with the father falling to the TV, i.e. Tron, and to take what they believed were game elements to the best of their kind of imaginative ability and do it that way.
So, in your opinion, why is it that I have never heard of an opera that would adapt such a thing? Like, I would love to see Metal Gear Solid, the opera.
I'm with you. Let me ask you one question. How long is the typical video game that has a really good story?
That is indeed a problem.
20 hours, 40 hours, 60 hours?
6 to 8.
60, 80?
No, 6 to 8.
6 to 8.
Yeah, at least Metal Gear Solid and stuff like that are outliers.
But if you were to rush to it beginning end, like someone like me who would be taking his time and screwing up and getting detected every third room, 20
It
hours.
depends on the game. Metal Gear Solid is an outlier. They're like 30 to 40 hours for an average player by most
Sure.
games. Nowadays, lasts around 8 hours for an average player.
But typically speaking, and I'm a huge fan of well-executed narratives as the next person. Like I said, the Bravacelis paper I have, which is more of a 3-hour presentation, is a complete deconstruction of what I feel to be the single best scene in narrative video game history. It can be done, but I don't think you can consume the whole thing. And at that point, then you go, well, how do you curate something like this? Video game to movie suffers from this problem to an extent too, right? How do you squeeze the entire story into, what is the typical preferred 102 minutes now? Is that the preferred length for a feature film generally?
88.
88?
They're
Oh, they're getting down to,
Yeah, I mean,
wow.
The Warcraft movie was like 2 hours, I think.
So even if you were willing and able to do a longer movie, you are still trying to fit a whole lot of story into a very confined space. Now, the best filmmakers find ways to convey as much information as possible in as short a time as possible. Kubrick is super famous for this, little cues and hints and presentations and, cinematography tricks to kind of describe things that might take a page in a book in just a second or two in film. So you can find ways to buy yourself time. But by and on the whole, video games have something intrinsic in them that most art forms suffer from, and that is the ability to keep you engaged for days of time. A book can hold your attention for a couple hours at a time and may take a week to read, but it is largely constructed of your imagination. A video game has to take the responsibility of the sound, the sights, the interactivity, this whole experience, and still, in these longer experiences, manages to do it for 20, 40, 60 hours for some of the longer RPGs. So I agree. I think video games are a terrific vehicle for conveying stories. They are one of my favorite vehicles for doing it because I think they have a way to communicate emotions to an audience in a less ham-fisted way. If you are invested personally because you're building up a character and something happens to that character, you don't even have to kill him if that character is incapacitated in some way. It's easy to tug at your heartstrings because you have personally invested time and effort into building something up only to see it get knocked down. You can root for characters in other mediums. In video games, you tend to build up characters. It can be very easy to get at somebody emotionally for bringing them low, which is about the most common way in any game you're going to get emotional rise out of somebody. But you have to understand that video games take such lengthy trips through their stories that Transmediation would have to be extremely careful, and it has failed often. The history of video game movies is not something we hold up proudly. We don't do big video game movie festivals for a reason. There are very few examples of success in this industry. It can be done. It just hasn't been done really well yet, and I don't think anyone's really found the way to distill that interactive experience into a statically digested format of sufficient length that has sufficient emotional heft and sufficient communication of the narrative.
Do you have a good example of an opera transmediated into a video game or into another art form in general, or another medium in general?
I do not yet have a great example of an opera being brought into a video game.
Final Fantasy VI.
No. Final Fantasy VI is a game that brought in opera's conventions. Again, this is sort of that phantom idea. Final Fantasy VI conceived an opera that did not exist and inserted it into its game to make an opera event in the game. But if you really do the deconstruction of the opera scene in Final Fantasy VI, the opera is not the opera. The events surrounding the opera are more the opera than the opera itself. The true drama in that scene doesn't necessarily come from Draco and Rolls fighting on the floor, it comes from the 4-ton weight that an octopus's attention pushed down upon the protagonist. The tension that the orchestra strikes up in that scene is not necessarily because of the arrival of the armies of the West. It's a leitmotif move, admittedly, but it's a dual-layered one because it simultaneously locks panicked sight upon seeing this event happening in the rafters. The switch from part 2 to part 3 of the opera scene, where they kick into that kind of high-paced, frenetic song, syncs up with the 5-minute timer that you have to stop this event from happening. When Locke lands on stage, Locke is not part of the opera, but when he stands up, he intentionally pretends to act and says, "I will save Maria," and the impresario goes, "Ugh, what awful acting." This is opera. That is what's known as a basso buffa. It is an intentionally bad performance done by somebody who is brought on stage to be bad on purpose in order to make the other performers look better. These are all actual conventions of opera, and if you deconstruct the FF6 opera scene and really step back and look at it, the opera isn't the opera. The opera is an opera that was imagined by Katase mostly in his production, but it's there to drive the other story, the external story, and a lot of exposition to the external story happens. You learn, I believe that's the point, you learn about Locke's White Knight complex because of Rachel's injury. There's a callback to Locke's rescue of Celis that is signposted a little bit and then referenced later when you're finally escaping the magic facility. Again, I warned you I could do this for 3 hours. But that, again, I think that's more of an example of what we saw for the first of these, this phantom transmediation, this first step, right? The step where we created a fake video game to insert into the magic flute to give it those elements. In the same case here, I feel the people behind FF6 made a fake opera, the Dreamwave opera, to insert into Final Fantasy VI so that they could then leverage the storytelling tricks of opera, all the little vehicles they use to convey things. Very, very cleverly, and this is why I sing the praises of the Dreamwave opera to this day, in such a way that it simultaneously told the story of the opera itself and the external events that were going around it, which were more an opera than the actual opera in the first place. Last note on that, aria di mezzo cantare, I believe roughly translates to air of medium tone. It's not really a good descriptor for what she's singing. It's really more of a cantabile. She hangs on lengthy notes for a period of time. It's very ornamented, and it's about romantic love. So I wouldn't describe it as di mezzo cantare, but that's the name of it, so it is what it is. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and call this a done panel. So thank you all so much for coming out here.